Okay, thank you very much and good afternoon, everyone. I'm not quite sure what I did to be up with Al Gore and saving the planet in The Guardian, but it was great to be there. A number of times this morning you heard reference of our new target. We've called it a Climate Stabilization Intensity Target, or a CSI target. Those of you who enjoy American television will know CSI as crime scene investigation, rather than climate stabilization intensity, but at least you might remember the CSI target as a result. And actually, as Paul Dickinson said, who's CEO of the Carbon Disclosure Project, when we launched the CSI target, he said, actually climate change is a crime scene. So hopefully this will do something to address that. What I'm going to do is explain to you what it is, how we've applied it to BT, and then suggest to you how it actually might be applied to the ICT industry as a whole. So what this slide here shows is that 2% of our our technologies, 2% of the total world CO2 footprint. We heard from Lewis Nevis this morning and from Donna about the opportunities to tackle the 98% through smart buildings, smart grids, smart logistics, smart motors, dematerialization, and so on. The provocative statement, are we wasting our time addressing the 2%? I would argue not. If we don't address the 2%, our own direct footprint, we won't have the credibility to go out in the marketplace and sell these opportunities to the other sectors. So let's have a look at that 2% footprint. This year, it is about 0.5 gigaton in total. Now, we know that we do a lot already in the industry to reduce the energy consumption of our technologies. And if the sector were not to grow, then we would expect to see our footprint reduced by 2020. But equally, as we heard this morning, we know that the sector is going to grow and that there are going to be a lot of social benefits for the growth of the sector as it grows into emerging economies. So through that growth, in terms of ICT delivered internationally under business as usual conditions, we would equally expect additional footprint to occur. And then if all those new opportunities for us to abate CO2 emissions in other sectors take place through this opportunity take-up of these smart options, our footprint may grow even further. So under business as usual conditions, we are absolutely expecting the footprint to grow. And when the Jesse report comes out, you will see what X actually is. Should we be satisfied with that growth? Will the NGO community be satisfied with this growth? And will the regulators be satisfied with that growth, even if we are helping tackle the remaining 98%? And I would say that the answer to all those three questions is no. We shouldn't be satisfied, I don't think the NGOs would be satisfied, and I don't think the regulators will be satisfied. So we have a challenge. We have a challenge to reduce our footprint beyond that 2020 business as usual projection. So let's look at a diagram from the Stern review. This shows all the CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions for the world from 1990 to today and then projected forward into the future. Today, we're sitting at about 47,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent from all the sources of emissions worldwide. Sorry, 47 gigatons, 47 billion tonnes. If you look at that in terms of per unit of GDP, it's 1.67 kilograms of CO2 per pound sterling of worldwide GDP. So every pound of the world economy converts and responsible for 1.67 kilograms of CO2 going up into the atmosphere. Now the top of this yellow here is the top of that, is the projection going forward, translated onto this blue line on this slide here. Now worldwide, scientists are now pretty much agreed that we need to reduce our footprint as it was in 1990 to half of that footprint. 50% reduction on the 1990 footprint by 2050, if we've got any chance of stabilizing the climate and preventing us slipping into catastrophic climate change. And what the colored lines are showing is that the longer we leave it, the more difficult it's going to get to achieve that target. And for developed countries, people are now saying that in order for the developing countries to develop and increase their emissions, developed countries and developed economies will need to aim for an 80% reduction on 1990 levels by 2050. So what does that mean in terms of CO2 per unit of economy? This graph here now shows you CO2 emissions worldwide per unit of worldwide GDP. Has actually gone down since 1990. Now we know what we've got to achieve in terms of CO2 in 2050. If we assume that the world economy is growing at the same rate on average it's grown since 1980, we can work out what the CO2 per unit of GDP needs to be in 2050. And that translates into a reduction of nearly 10% in terms of CO2 per unit of economic, in terms of per GDP. Just think about that for a moment. For every unit of GDP, every year, we've got to take nearly 10% of CO2 out of that unit of GDP in developed economies. This is a huge challenge that's in front of us all. This is called an intensity. When you measure CO2 per unit of GDP, it's called an intensity. And a number of countries have set intensity targets. And what this graph is showing you here is in red, you can see absolute emissions, and in the grey, the intensity. So if you look at France, for example, whilst they have improved their intensity, the absolute emissions have gone up. In the USA, their intensity has improved, but their absolute emissions have gone up considerably. So you have to be a bit careful with intensity targets because you could actually have an improving intensity but increasing absolute emissions. This is what countries in the developed world need to do. Reduce their CO2 intensity at nearly 10% per annum. So if that's what a country should do, what should a company do? A company should match or exceed that trend. So in terms of a company's CO2 per unit of contribution it makes to the economy, in other words, in terms of the amount of wealth it generates in the world, a company should reduce by the same amount. That's the basis of a CSI target. Now, a company's contribution to GDP is defined as its value added. And you'll be familiar, many of you, with that value added because it's the basis of course, value added tax that we all pay. And value added, in terms of the accounting, is equal to the profit, EBITDA, of a company plus its employee costs. Or another way of expressing it is turnover or revenue minus the cost of bought-in goods and services. It's a very, very familiar accounting principle, and I'm sure if you talk to your finance people, they'd be able to explain to you about value added. So I've worked out what BT's CO2 per unit of value added actually is. And that's displayed on this graph. So the intensity, CO2 per unit of value added, for BT, what you can see is it's about 1/10 of the world average. That tells us that we, as in BT, and most likely the ICT industry as a whole, is 10 times better at creating wealth in terms of emissions of CO2 than the world economy on an average basis is. So actually we're pretty low carbon intensity business. But the question is, on this slide, is BT dropping as fast as this curve is dropping? Because that's what we've got to aim for. So if I join the two curves up together, you can see if we're dropping at the same speed. And yes, to date we've done somewhat better than the curve. But what this allows us to model now is knowing how we expect BT to grow as a business, to model our CO2 intensity emissions going forward, and to set ourselves a target. So this is BT's new target, CO2 intensity reduction target of an 80% reduction against our 96 levels by 2020. Just to show you that our emissions are dropping in real terms, we're not dodging the difficult question, that's how we expect our CO2 emissions for as a company worldwide to reduce by 2050. So a few words on the advantages of this approach. Firstly, it combines environmental performance with financial performance. Often, when we're doing environmental issues in a company, we look at them in isolation to the commercial realities of the business. So here, what we're doing in the target is actually combining the two. And in addition to that, it combines our environmental performance to that the world has to achieve, and our financial performance to the world economy. And what this does is it allows us to accommodate the normal dynamics of business. It provides a framework for future strategy and straightforward benchmarking. So if I have a few more minutes, I'd just like to relate this back into the ICT sector. So let me just skip this slide, which summarizes the target then. So here's the ICT sector, where we started off the presentation. Here's a quote from the Bali Action Plan, which is effectively saying, look out sectors, because we're going to look to expect sectoral approaches to reducing CO2 emissions. That's what we're doing here today. This could quite easily in the future translate into, can you set a sectoral target for your direct footprint in terms of CO2 emissions? So could we? Here's the footprint again. Let's now look at it in terms of adding in the value added. So this is the value added of the ICT sector in 2008, we're expecting that to grow substantially. Our industry will grow substantially by 2020. And then if we look at the CSI target, our intensity then will shrink. So could we set ourselves an intensity target that doesn't constrict the growth of the industry, but at the same time drives down CO2 emissions? Key to this will be renewable electricity. Can we build it into our products? Can we put it on our sites? Can we purchase renewable electricity? And should we actually start to lobby governments to create the right investment framework for more renewables? Because electricity dominates our footprint in terms of the products that we sell and our operations. So in conclusion, I believe the ICT sector should deliver these smart opportunities to our customers, but be ready for NGOs to challenge our direct footprint, be prepared for an ICT sector obligation to come, consider using that CSI methodology to respond to such an obligation. We should push as hard as we can for as much renewable electricity as we can, because that will drive our direct footprint down. Absolutely use our high-tech creativity. And in terms of the standards, low carbon should be the standard. Thank you very much.